but we don't have infinite time, so I'd like to ask you guys one question and then toss it over to the audience for that sake. The restoration and the re-output of this film is such a special thing for the both of you. Can you speak to that process and what it was like, putting it back out, new scan, what was that like?
Sure. So one thing I'll step back and say that this film has really had a life of its own for a very long time. Being taught in different film schools, being passed around on VHS tapes before there was a digital restoration in early 2004. There's been a continual life of the film and almost a cult, following. My father passed in '08, and I mentioned in the introduction how, really the preservation of the work is really what's key, protecting the legacy, but ensuring that folks had a chance to see the film on large screens. Because it was suppressed and taken away, it's always someone who tells the story of seeing it in a grainy, VHS, or the sound wasn't great, or something of that nature. In 2012, I mentioned that the film became a part of the National Film Registry. I met a gentleman who worked on another restoration with the Library of Congress of Nothing But a Man, which was a film that my father was the lead in. And he turned me on to those folks at the Library of Congress. And like I said, their goals align with what our goals were. They helped us through that whole grant process. It was a pretty lengthy process, full submissions, but fortunately, because he had kept the film in a vault and in such great condition, the actual restoration was not that difficult. All the tracks were in really, really good shape. Only one restoration had been done before to digital. So that process, once it got started, was not as difficult as it seems. But, it was important for us. I have a brother. We're the only two remaining. I had two other brothers that passed away. Where are we going to have this film so that it is housed in perpetuity and that people will have access when they want to see it? So that's really kind of the story of what happened with the restoration.
Natiki, any thoughts?
Well, just to add, the idea that the intention of our fathers was to share this film and to share this message with everyone. And I'm just so glad that we're able to do that. And every time we get an opportunity to sit in front of audiences like this and you get to see this film, it's a reminder of how amazing these two men were and how tenacious they were in terms of making sure they got it done so that we can all see and enjoy it.
In the 70s, being a stunt worker must have been so difficult, and those guys got rattled around so much. I'd like to toss it on over to the audience, but before that, I would like to announce that for audience questions, we have copies of the book by Sam Greenlee to pass out to those who have questions. So, without further ado, anyone have any questions? Yeah, right in the front. Yeah, all of them went up. Yeah, right in the front.
Thanks. Thank you so much for being here. This is an amazing film, and I'm glad when I have a chance to see it. Question, how much research did your fathers do into the CIA recruitment and training process? And it's such a fascinating part of the film, just seeing, those behind-the-scenes look at the CIA and how people are brought into that.
Well, my father's history, I think, to share a little bit, this book and movie are semi-autobiographical. In that my father was a military man, also was a part of the United States Information Agency, and was a propagandist for that agency, and learned a lot about the military. So a lot of what you see on film in terms of what he was also wrote in the book was all the information that he had gathered throughout his time in the military, along with other people that he knew. So it was a lot of his own experiences, but a lot of the experiences that he was able to access through other people.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Caveat, I've only got 10 books.
Any other questions? Yeah, you.
It wasn't lost on me the fact that initial riot, the people who were rioting against were all black policemen. I thought that was very interesting when you did it to show that part, maybe the reason behind that. But I'm also remembering another version of it. Maybe I'm remembering the book, but wasn't there a version at the end of it? He was at the end, was making a toast. Maybe I don't know if it's in the book or maybe the version I saw. Didn't he say, "Go get them, Cobras," or something like that in one of the versions?
So,
Am I mistaken?
I don't think you're mistaken in that there was an earlier cut of the film that was done, but then the final cut of the film is what you see here from the master. And then just one other quick comment about the riot scene, and this is where Gary, Indiana comes into play. At the time, in '73, as you can imagine, Mayor Daley was not in approval of giving film permits to shoot in Chicago. So, Natiki mentioned in her intro comments that a lot of these were shots on the fly that were in Chicago. But Mayor Hatcher and Gary, one of the first black mayors in the country, but certainly the first black mayor, Gary, gave them pretty much free reign. So a lot of the shots that you see of the, torn down blocks, they gave them a couple of blocks to do that. In the scenes of the riot, some of the people thought there was an actual riot. We had a panel with, fortunately, 3 of the remaining living cast members, and one of them talked about the woman who's, swinging the purse and everything. She had no idea that this was really a filming. So it was a cold night that night, they say, and there was a little drinking going on, etc. And it kind of escalated into a situation. But that, to me, is just a testament of the time. You think about this was shortly after the riots in summer. It speaks to the frustration and some of the anger in people, etc. But they really couldn't have gotten this done without the help of Mayor Hatcher. And so when we talk about the awe of these men and women that were involved, but taking the risk to do these things at that time, these were messages, this was not your typical blaxploitation film. This was a film of thought and thought-provoking.
Yeah, right here.
Yes, I want to thank you both for being here tonight, sharing the film with us. My grandfather, who passed in 2013, but throughout my childhood, he always spoke of this movie. He's like, whenever I'm having a chance to show you this, I can't wait to show you this. So seeing it has been great. But I wanted to ask you both, do you have any knowledge of what authors inspired your father to write the book, or who he was reading, and also as far as filmmakers, which filmmakers were your father watching and studying?
It's hard to pinpoint just a few. My father had a pretty extensive library that I wish I inherited. But it's interesting that my father spent a lot of his time really delving into the experience. I mean, I think a lot of what you see is really his own living pain. A lot of this is birthed in his own spirit, so to speak, and not necessarily motivated by somebody else. I mean, certainly he was born in the 1930s and during the Depression in Chicago, and you can only imagine what Chicago looked like in the 30s. And him and his brother, raised by his grandmother, and was able to fight through all of that and joined the military, went to the University of Wisconsin on an athletic scholarship. And I say all this to say this is the research. On an athletic scholarship, and then got his, went to the University of Chicago as well, and wanted to be an attorney and decided not to, told his grandmother he wants to be a writer, and she's like, and how you gonna make money? And so I think the living experience, of course he lived through all the era and was old enough during that period of time to really fully understand what was happening around him. So a lot of what you're asking is definitely, the research came from a lot of his own experience. But also, he read everybody. He was a fan of all writers. I can't say all the names. I don't want to make it seem as though it was only this and not that. I think it was a combination of people. Certainly the bigger revolutionary, he's a big fan of poetry as well, so the bigger revolutionary writers were definitely his favorite for sure.
And from my father's side, also born in the 30s in Harlem, and I think that's a part of why the book resonated so much with him. If you think about the experience, the Black experience at that time of the male, but the book itself inspired him. He was always looking for different material and books, like I mentioned, avid reader, but other filmmakers as well. He was inspired a lot by African filmmakers and Bang, but he had been working in the industry for quite some time. And he, at the same time, was very concerned and always thinking about the Black experience. And so as this project came about, I believe it kind of melded he knew the power of film and what that could do in communicating certain messages. So it was kind of the next evolution for him in terms of moving from acting to directing. It married with some of his personal thoughts, etc., but inspiration from a lot of different filmmakers as well.
You miss in the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the restoration of this film. How did your father ever tell you Mr. Greenlee, when he wrote the book, how he kind of very carefully wrote like the juxtaposition between how when you are educated, you feel like you can change things from the inside, like maybe Dawson thought he could, but then the reality of when you're in it, it's not always easy. Did he ever kind of talk to you about how he kind of wove that in there?
How much time do you have? One of the things that I admire the most about my father, and for those of you who are a little older in the room, a little more seasoned, in the room, you probably have either seen him or heard about him or so forth. He was a big fan of community, and at the heart of my father was just a love of his community. He was an educated man, and he was, a part of a fraternity and all the things, that we think we should do in order to fit into society. And yet, he lived in contrast, which I think is extremely exciting and interesting at the same time. I mean, a lot of the environments where he could fit in, he just chose not to. And I like that you're saying you see that, and in the film you'll see, and also in the book you'll read, a lot of what he felt and believed. I mean, there's classism and racism and sexism. I mean, all the isms are here, specifically to our community, not necessarily outside of it. A lot of the challenges that we face in our own communities. And that was the biggest fight for him, was really wanting our communities to get unified and organized. And so at the heart of message for him was that, unifying the community, educating, unifying our community so that we can do for ourselves. And so you speak about the challenges of being kind of in something, getting educated so you can be a part of something to change it from the inside out, right? Like, that's the exciting part. I'm going to college, I'm going to change the world, right? And I think that's a great way to feel, but I think the reality is definitely that once you get inside, you realize you have less power to change things than you thought. And then the higher you go, the less opportunity you have to do the most changing, the most work, because now you have to answer to, So essentially this was really the message that he wanted to communicate. And I love that you saw that in this film. I'm glad you're getting a book, because you really don't love that.
And I tack on to that, very similar in terms of their focus. And I never really thought about this before, just you saying this, in that my father did a lot of work within the industry to try to help to get African Americans behind the camera. and was always fighting and, you know, setting up organizations and getting people in the union and doing all of these things. And that's just another tie of how it parallels in terms of just the fight and the struggle and the frustration. He talked about this film sometimes as a fantasy of what could happen, or a fantasy acting out of fantasy within the film, more so than what could actually happen. But yeah, it's really a tie there in terms of that whole struggle. And yeah, I just thought about that in terms of just his world, in terms of fighting within an industry to have representation, both on the screen and behind the camera.
Next question.
Ignoring the back.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. You've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, I want to take that too. My question of this is along the lines of what this woman said. I am of the seasoned group. And when we went into corporate America as the first generation of African Americans, I can't recall how it happened, but just through conversation, this became the must-read book, because we were all desperate to find a strategy that we could use within the corporate world that, you know, we had no experience with. And this became the go-to book. And it was all about growing where you're planted. And what we took away was all of the adversity that he faced within the CIA. He was able to collect knowledge and then utilize that knowledge to grow and help others. And even as my two college graduates went into corporate America, I made it a must-read, as did their dad. I guess my question is, because I'm going back 40 years, not to tell my age, but was that intentional? I always thought it was. I always thought that this was kind of like the rite of passage, you know, for professional African Americans, was to read this book. And I don't know, was it intentional, or did it just kind of happen as we evolved in the late 70s?
Thank you so much. Yes, it's intentional. Absolutely. The message, and I'm glad you said that, because I think sometimes the takeaway from this film is, yeah, let's go and get guns and shoot everybody. Like, that's not the message. The message is simply exactly what you said, and I love how you said it. And the message was to learn everything you can, to acquire knowledge, and then share that knowledge to elevate others. I mean, that's the ultimate goal of life, right? Is to not just to take things, but also to take things and then pass them on. And so, which is why I was saying my father was a big fan of communities, because that's all he did all of his life. He has, you know, so many mentors, mentees, people that he's mentored over the years who still connect with me and say, oh my gosh, your father changed my life, or he handed me the book and I haven't been the same. The intent was to empower the community to say, wherever you are, wherever you're planted, you're supposed to then grow and then plant a seed somewhere else, right? I think that's the ultimate goal of nature, right? So that's why we have all these beautiful trees and everything else, because they grow and then they pass on things so that others can grow, right? So ultimately that was the goal. So I thank you for saying that. Thank you.
Well, you in the way back, and then you.
Okay, great. We'll go here first.
How many books do you have left?
Yeah, great question there, and that's really something that's talked about often. So this was independently produced, and when they started out, they really had to go to the community to get the funds. And a part of that story is, you know, sometimes the folks that you thought would be the first to contribute to the funding were not. So a lot of these individuals were, you know, restaurateurs, were, you know, everyday people, were dentists, etc., that actually pooled the funds together to actually start the production of the film. The original budget of the film was a little under 800,000 or so. They actually started the film with $48,000. And this was a stop and start kind of effort. There were scenes in Chicago and Gary, but also shot in Los Angeles. And it literally was stop and start. It was towards the end where they needed completion funds that United Artists became involved with the completion funds and with the distribution, right? But this whole project is an example of coming together as community, coming together and making something happen.
Right here.
Hi. I was just wondering about the grandmother who learned how to read from your dad. I was in the book club for 30 years, and I've done adult literacy up until the time of the pandemic that we recently had. So I was just wondering about her. What did she read once she learned how to read? Do you know?
That is very emotional for me. I was saying, a little while ago that this is a semi-autobiographical. My great-grandmother, he was raised by his grandmother, but my great-grandmother, she could not read. And so this is true that he did help his grandmother learn how to read. And it was an important part of his life because he recognized that he had all these opportunities, and that she did not have those opportunities, but he wanted to bring those opportunities to her. So I love what you're doing. I don't know specifically what book. He didn't really mention that too much. I think the most important part for him was that at the end of that, she was able to read, and he was incredibly excited about that and knew what that meant for her. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Right here in the center.
Thank you. Good evening. When I hadn't read this book. When I read books and I've watched TV or movies, they never match. How much of the film matches the book?
We can both take that. So I would love for you to read the book first, and then you could tell me. But I will say this. It is true. It is very difficult sometimes to watch a movie and then go read the book because you're saying, oh man, that's not how the book is. Or read the book and see the film. You're like, oh man, they just left some of the most important parts out. This is not that. Because my father was not just, thank you, the gentleman shaking his head. Because my father was also writing the script as well as the book. I mean, a lot of times you don't have that either. But it was important for him to put the most intricate parts, the most defining parts of the book in the film. And Ivan Dixon did an amazing job visually exploring some of those concepts that are really hard to capture on film. But I mean, give me a second because I can get excited about all of this. But even the moment, and I think I told this to Noma, when Joy puts the wig on the mannequin's head, it's an important moment in the story about who she is and how she identifies, and the difference between Joy and the nameless woman, the prostitute. We don't have a name for her, right? The Dahomey Queen. And they start off in a space that you say, oh, these are two different people in different parts of society, and yet one grows into her full glory, and the other one is still kind of reverting, right? And so to capture that on film, I think was pretty amazing. I just can't thank Ivan Dixon enough for really allowing the book and the film to speak and hold hands like very, very, very closely. Yeah.
And I think that's where there was such a great pairing too. And first, fundamentally you have the work that's there and writing the screenplay, etc. But I think what my father could bring to it was the cinematic pieces of it. He also allowed the actors, he was they say an actor's director, right? So he allowed the actors some reign as well and what they contributed. But I think that's really kind of what made them really a good pairing in terms of bringing it to the level of the film. But I will tell you, we've had screenings where, in fact, one of our panelists, because this book was also some required reading for the Black Panther Party, they were like, oh no, this is nothing like the book. They were, he tells a story that he actually told your father that, this film needs to be redone, etc. This doesn't match up to the book, right? Then years later, after working together with him too on some other things, came back and he apologized to him and he said, I was wrong. This took it to a different level on the screen. But I think, it is important to read the book and to see the film.
Great questions and great responses. We learned so much, and that concludes our time here today.
One question. How much did
Feel free to ask it out in the lobby.
Park inspire your father? He was the first African American to be on Time and Look magazine, and he also was a movie maker also.
Yes, he was, and I think a lot of the filmmakers of that time and before him definitely inspired him. I was inspired by him. He was inspired by the African filmmakers I mentioned, by Melvin Van Peebles, who, started really with some of the independently produced productions. But yeah, he found inspiration from what was his village, at that time as an artist as well.
Thank you so much, folks. Feel free to ask questions out in the lobby as well.